待会晚一点还会有朋友加入我们。那我们今天很欢迎 Dr. Helen Caldicott 来这里跟我们介绍辐射对人体的影响。那其实Dr. Helen Caldicott 也在问我们，其实问了我们好几次了哈，说他来这次对我们有什么用啊？好，那以后我们为什么要请他来？那我的想法是这样，第一个，其实台湾你可以说世界上对于辐射对人体的影响，真的很了解的人是蛮有限的。那待会Dr. Caldicott 会告诉我们为什么会有这样的现象，那哪里可以去找到资料？所以第一个就是让我们了解这个专业。这个事件的真相，那另外一个呢，其实要给我们一些刺激。刺激是说Dr. Caldicott 从15岁他就觉得开始感觉到核电的问题。那为什么他可以持续这么久呢？那我们在场的有一些人也是做了反核，做了一阵子了嘛，哈。可是我觉得大家都觉得好累，那是不是 Dr. Caldicott 可以刺激我们，让我们可以一直做下去？当然，我们希望我们不要到75岁才达到目的，我们希望我们明年或者是下个月就达到目的，或者今年底，好，所以要给我们一些刺激，好，那当然，其实他从他的专业。来跟我们讲这些事情，其实也要警惕我们说我们做这些核电的这些问题的人，我们也要针对这些永和人的一些谬误，我们要从不同的专业去批判他们，要不停的说，不停的讲，不停的写，这样子才能够教育更多的人。让大家知道这个事情的真相。那今天呢，我们是跟阿米巴社还有妈妈监督核电联盟合办这一场。那我就先请阿米巴社的社长林医师来跟我们讲一些话。
谢谢主持人徐教授。Dr. Caldicott，各位大家晚安。阿米巴社很荣幸可以在这个时间点跟大家在一起来举办这样的这个演讲会。那其实刚刚徐教授很简单的点出，其实重点就在于说，人类对反核事实上是并没有学到教训。那我只提出2点，一点叫做我是人我反核。第二个是我是医师我反核。那我是人我反核的主要论述，大概跟我们日本的这个诺贝尔得奖大家介绍一样的一个想法。因为核子核子在于没有关系。那个核子对于人类或者对于这块土地是没有办法在短时间内消除。那所以人类一再的犯错，那这个犯错并没有汲取到人类应该汲取的这个教训，这个是最重要的。那为什么大家会提出这样的一个想法？因为呢，全世界只有日本有遭受这个2颗原子弹原爆症的一个伤害，那当场死亡大概有7万人，那后续的大概有30几万人是遭受在核辐射的伤害，那这些呢都变成慢性化，就是呢他们身上所有的以前都认为说核辐射只会造成癌症，事实上是错误的。核辐射不只造成癌症，他身体上很多器官都会因为核辐射的伤害呢，造成 慢性化。那我们知道现在台湾其实是慢性化一个慢性病很严重的一个地方。那如果再加上这个核辐射的伤害，那这些人的身体就会受到更大的这个伤害。那第二点就是我刚刚接续的刚刚对于身体器官的伤害。所以呢，我是人，我是医师，我就要缓和的原因在这个地方。因为一个医师呢，最容易接触到他身边的病人，身边的病人有什么样的情况，其实一个医师呢最清楚。那你从在医学上所有的资讯显示，不仅会造成这个细胞本身细胞核跟 DNA 的变化之外呢，可能对身体的其他器官的这个细胞的伤害，也会造成它器官永久性无法恢复的一个情况。那这一些呢，都是已经有非常多的记录包括最近大家有看到这个福岛电厂的这个厂长因为呢，这个是不是长期工作在这个辐射线之下呢，引发他的食道癌那当然这还有争论但是呢，基本上大家都有一个共识，就是如果接受长期的辐射的话，基本上癌症 cancer 在身体上产生的机会就比一般人来得高。这个我想这已经是一个 definite 非常这个确定的一个状况。那碘131是一个情况碘131是一个情况，但因为碘131的半衰期比较短，所以在大气中，在环境中被消化的机会，或者是 decay 的机会是比较可以在控制的范围内。另外还有一个铯238这个是一个对环境的伤害，是所谓的我们以人类的观点应该叫 permanent 因为我们人类的寿命只有80年嘛现在台湾的寿命只有80 years，but铯238呢，可以在大气中，可以在环境中伤害200年，甚至于300年。所以为什么福岛的居民没有办法回到他们祖先居住的地方？最大的原因在这个地方所以我只简单的跟大家，因为我外面有写一个这个简介如果大家对英文如果不是很清楚的话，可以先看一下简介因为简介基本上里面就是很提纲挈领的，因为我刚好有机会到日本去跟兵库县的一些医师，因为兵库县很靠近广岛跟长崎，所以他们有很多的病人是流落在兵库县里面。那日本是有所谓的这个原爆症的这个补助啦，所以跟台湾一样，就可能看诊不用挂号费或看诊不用负担，所以他们的病人会流落在这些这个诊所或者医院里面。那这些都是慢性化的病人，常常是因为虚弱，常常因为身体这个多重器官的衰竭等等，必须要留连在医院里面。那这个是为什么一个医师为什么要缓和很重要的原因。以上我们代表台湾市的医师欢迎Dr. Helen 可以到台中来。那我们台中大概有6000位医师那如果有机会的话，可以跟这个Dr. Helen 可以做一个这个座谈，或者是说比较深入的一个这个讨论，交换一些意见让这个是对我们来缓和有一些更深的这个所谓理论的这个主张，这个我想非常重要的好，以上因为时间的关系谢谢大家，谢谢。
那妈妈监督核电联盟，好，谢谢。
非常谢谢大家今天拨冗来参加，特别是因为有好多人都是有医学背景的，我想这个对我们民众来说是非常重要的，因为台湾使用30多年的核电了，可是对于整体的，就是使用核电周遭附近，甚至包括我们在兰屿放了那么多年的核废料，可是我们对于当地居民的健康，到现在都没有做一个彻底的追踪调查或者长期的观察，这个是我们对他们不公义的一个地方。但是对于民众对于核电 不是对健康的影响，我觉得医生是最有资格来说的。非常期待，就是说透过医生们你们的对这个议题的理解，让我们的民众有更多了解的机会，至少你们病患会知道。而且台中是我们将来最需要，应该说中部地区是我们最需要努力的地方，因为北部有核一、核二，南部有核三，在中部很多人觉得说核电厂离我很远，发生灾难的时候没有关系。我妈妈说，你的更来就华了因为我彰化人，大佬不知道要安怎所以中部地区是我们家最需要努力的地方。我觉得你们就是我们最好的种子，谢谢你们，谢谢。
顺美，那我们现在就热烈的掌声来欢迎Caldicott来给我们说明。
Can we have this up, please? Okay. Okay, that's good. So, how do you do? I've just been in Japan talking to a group of high-powered politicians and people about Fukushima. When the accident happened, I was in Australia, and the first we knew about it was on Twitter. And then we turned on the television and saw the tsunami coming in. And then I realized, I think a day later, what that would mean to the Fukushima reactors. And I suddenly got this terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach, like knowing a patient was going to die. And I realized that this accident would never end, and it would be an absolute, total catastrophe, the likes of which the world had never seen before. So what happened was, the earthquake occurred, it actually damaged the reactors, and then they lost their external power supply because of the earthquake, and then they turned on the diesel generators, which were underneath the reactors, each as large as a house, and in came the tsunami and drowned the diesel generators. So they had some little batteries that could keep the power going for 8 hours, and that's all. They lost the power. Now each reactor needs 1 million gallons a minute of water to keep it cool, coming in from the ocean. So therefore it needs pumps to circulate the water. The pumps stopped, and because each reactor contained 100 tons of uranium, incredibly thermally hot from fission products, within a few hours the uranium was so hot it started to melt. And within a few hours it melted through 6 inches of steel, the reactor container, vessel, onto the floor of the containment building, the concrete floor. As it melted, the zirconium fuel cladding reacted with the water to produce hydrogen. And they couldn't, there was a valve that had to be turned to release the hydrogen and release the pressure, but the valve wouldn't work with electricity, and they had no electricity, so they had to send men into a very, very hot area to turn the valve manually, and it really didn't work. So there was no preparation for such an accident. So the 100 tons of uranium turned into molten lava, and it's still there. It's called corium. And then we had hydrogen explosions in number 1 unit, in number 2 unit, and number 3 unit we think was not a hydrogen explosion but an atomic explosion. The fuel pool we think reached critical mass. And if you look at the videos, there's a big black cloud going up, and they found pieces of plutonium and fuel rod kilometers away, which meant that there was an extremely, it's called an excursion, atomic excursion, powerful explosion. And then Unit 4, there was another explosion. They quite can't understand what actually happened. So at the time, the man who has just died of esophageal cancer was the manager. And TEPCO was talking about evacuating the workers. If the workers had been evacuated, the whole thing would have gone crazy and it would have been virtually the end of Japan. And there's another set of 4 reactors about 4 miles down the coast called Fukushima Daini, and they would have had to evacuate too, and the whole thing would have been an atomic catastrophe. So he was encouraging the workers to stay at their peril. In fact, they were like samurai warriors. They were prepared to commit suicide to save Japan, and that man was a hero, and he's just died of esophageal cancer. So the Japanese government and TEPCO are saying, well, it wasn't because of the accident, but he's worked in nuclear reactors for many years, therefore exposed to internal emitters and external radiation, and the chances are that his esophageal cancer was caused by radiation. Every single type of cancer can be induced by radiation. But the Atomic Energy Commission and the World Health Organization and the International Atomic Energy Agency, which are like that with World Health Organization, they only look at thyroid cancer. They don't look at any other sort of cancer. So, now where was I? So what happened was then Naoto Kan, the Prime Minister, was so concerned, and they were talking about evacuating Tokyo, 35 million people. Can you imagine? They couldn't. And so he flew in a helicopter to the reactors, and he said, people, the workers have to stay there. And then TEPCO, because there was no fresh water to pump in, they wanted to save the reactors. If they put salt water in the reactors, that would be the end of them, and TEPCO would have lost billions of dollars or yen, because the salt water corrodes the reactors, and that would be the end of them. However, salt water was the only way that they could keep the reactors cool and not more nuclear explosions. So the man who's just died put salt, against TEPCO orders, put salt water into the reactors and kind of prevented a much worse situation. And it would have affected Taiwan, because in the first 3 days the wind was blowing across the Pacific. And so 80% of the radiation released flew across the Pacific. And the ambient levels of radiation in Seattle went up 40,000 times above normal. So America copped a lot, and very shortly, within days, the whole of the northern hemisphere was blanketed with radiation. Then the wind turned and blew the radiation up to the northwest over the Fukushima prefecture. Now, I'm sure you got some fallout in Taiwan because the wind was blowing towards the west and I'm sure south, right? Now, the Japanese government knew where the radiation was going, partly because the Americans were flying planes to test and see where it went, because the Americans have got a lot of American troops in Tokyo and a big Air Force base, and they were trying to look after their troops. The Japanese government, though, didn't tell the people where the radiation was going, and the people fled into the path of the highest radiation dose, because they said they didn't want to create panic. Now think of that from a medical perspective. How dare they not inform the people about where the radiation was going? Of course the people would be panicked. They were panicked anyway. And in fact, if you look at this chart, now, have we got a pointer? Yes. No. Yeah, good. Yeah. So here we are, and this is after 3 days. This is extremely high level radiation, of course, and that's an exclusion zone, although the exclusion zone is now only 20 kilometres and it's beyond that, the radiation. But you can see this is an intense area of fallout. And Tokyo got doused with a large dose. In fact, they've taken soil and moss from Tokyo to America and tested it for isotopes. And it's so radioactive, full of uranium, cesium, I think some plutonium, that it's so radioactive that, according to standards, it will be sent to a radioactive waste dump in America. People are living in Tokyo with that radiation. The Japanese sleep on the floor, on their tatami mats. There's dust in the house. They measure the dust from a vacuum cleaner. It's very radioactive. They looked at what's it called in a car? Not a ventilation, when they take the air through to clean the car, what's it called? I can't think. Both for the engine and the passengers. And they found very high levels of radiation, including plutonium, in those devices. Now, a car sucks in about the same amount of air that we inhale per day into our lungs. So you'd extrapolate from those car devices into our lungs to work out how much radiation people are breathing in. And this lighter colour here formed, that's also radiation. So you can see a very large area of Japan has been contaminated. Now, that's 2 years ago. I held a symposium at the New York Academy of Medicine on the medical consequences of Fukushima with the very best scientists in the world. And I had an oceanographer who's measuring the water levels. More radiation has been released into the Pacific than ever in human history, and it keeps going. More and more radiation. Every day the levels are rising of tritium and strontium and cesium in the water. What happens when cesium and strontium get into the water? What happens to the fish? Well, it bioconcentrates from the water into the algae, orders of magnitude, 10, 100 times. Then the crustaceans, orders of magnitude more. Then the little fish, and then the big fish. So the food chain, the food chain oh dear. The food chain the nuclear power plants must be having a problem. So the fish bioconcentrate, and they're finding 60% of the fish caught off Fukushima are highly radioactive, and especially the bottom-dwelling fish. And consistently, every day, more and more radiation is escaping because the groundwater is seeping into the containment vessels, which are all cracked. And the groundwater goes over the corium and comes out again extremely radioactive, and they don't know what to do with it. 400 tons of water a day they're collecting, which is so radioactive, they're putting it in huge tanks. They've got hundreds of tanks full of radioactive water stored at the site. But soon they'll run out of tanks, because this is going to go on for 50 years. So what will they do? It'll go into the Pacific Ocean. The fishermen don't want it to go into the Pacific Ocean because it will destroy their fishing industry. But that's where it will go. In other words, the Pacific Ocean is going to become highly contaminated. Yes, it's a huge body of water. There will be dilution, but the solution to pollution by dilution is fallacious when it comes to radiation, because you get bioconcentration back in the food chain and in the human body, in our organs, okay? Now, there's a very serious situation still going on here. Not just it's going to take 50 years to work out what to do there, because they have no idea. That's like having a patient with a new disease. Like after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these patients develop purpura, alopecia, vomiting, and no one had seen ever this illness before. And of course it was acute radiation illness, and these patients died. New disease. Well, this is a new situation in the nuclear industry. They haven't a clue what to do. But Building 4 was severely damaged by the earthquake. It's very fragile. And atop Building 4 is a cooling pool with 100 tons of highly radioactive fuel. And if there's another earthquake, the building they predict will collapse. Down will come the cooling pool, and then it will lose the cooling water, and the fuel rods will burn, releasing 10 times more cesium-137 than was released at Chernobyl. And so the Japanese government are contemplating evacuating 55 million people. If this happens, you're in great trouble. I know you're quite far south down here, right?
Yeah.
But the wind could easily be blowing down here. It will contaminate seriously the whole of the Northern Hemisphere. And I've got 2 grandchildren in Boston. One of them is 4. Children are 10 to 20 times more sensitive to radiation than adults. I'm going to fly my children out to Australia because the air masses in the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere do not mix at the equator. My son said, "But Mum, we'll be refugees." And I said, "I don't care, you've got little children." This is the situation. So they're trying to reinforce Building 4 with big steel beams so that they can lift a huge crane on top of it to lift by remote control the fuel rods out of the pool. It might take 1 or 2 years. What you should know as physicians is that you are in great danger if this goes. In fact, the whole of the northern, and the media is not talking about it. We don't know about it. Why aren't they educating us? Why aren't they teaching us? There's a total cover-up in Japan. Collusion, corruption, the Yakuza, you know who the Yakuza are? The mafia. They're bringing in the workers from Tokyo, homeless men. The workers, 24,000, are not being followed up medically to see what is happening. They cover their badges with lead, their radiation badges, so that they're not measuring the amount of radiation they're exposed to. It's absolute pandemonium and catastrophe. It's interesting that the Russians were much more proactive. They moved people out very fast after they realised what had happened. The Japanese have left the people there. And they're even feeding the children in kindergarten with radioactive food, radioactive rice grown in Fukushima. They're encouraging the farmers now to plant their rice and grow food. And I heard you had an affair or a fair in Taipei where Fukushima food was sold, and a lot of people bought it. So people don't understand if they eat radioactive food that they might get cancer later. So the situation is dire, and none of us really know about it. If Building 4 goes, we're going to have to cope. What do you do with radioactive patients? Say you had a meltdown at one of your reactors, and you can see how far the radiation went. If you have a meltdown at one of your reactors in the south or the north, it's going to totally contaminate Taiwan. Yet they're talking about, we met the fire chief in Taipei. He said, "Oh, we'll evacuate people and we'll shelter them." You can't do that. So Taiwan would be gone. Therefore, medically, it is indicated that your 4 or 6 or 8 reactors be closed. Certainly, building that number 4 must not be built and opened, but all of them medically must be closed because they're cancer factories. Now, let's see the next slide. Someone. Yeah, here we are. So here's Chernobyl. Oh, I can do it. Oh, goody. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Here's Chernobyl, right? And this is Europe, Scandinavia, England. And here's the reactor. Well, it was a reactor. There's nothing there. There was a massive explosion, and then the reactor burned for 10 days, pushing thermally the radiation up to the stratosphere, which circled the northern hemisphere. And this is Europe, and it's only a map of cesium-137, not the other isotopes. But 40% of Europe is now contaminated with radioactive elements. Children who were in utero at the time in Sweden have lower than normal IQs because the developing nervous system is very susceptible to radiation. They're finding birds who are in the exclusion zones have smaller than normal brains. So what happens to the birds happens to us. There's already, according to the New York Academy of Sciences, 1 million people have died from Chernobyl. But did you know that? World Health Organization says 40, or they say maybe 4,000. They're lying. And World Health Organization has an agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency that they won't do any research on any nuclear accident unless the IAEA tells them. But the IAEA, its mission is to promote nuclear power. So where do you get the truth? That's the thing. And the report from the New York Academy of Sciences was put together. 5,000 papers in Slavic were translated into English and published. And in fact, I have the report here, which is one of the scariest medical documents that I've ever read. And you can download it from the net. Okay? I think it's imperative that all doctors read this. And there were many diseases caused by the radiation. One is progeria, early aging in children. Many cataracts. It causes diabetes because cesium concentrates in the pancreas. Sudden heart attacks in children. Cesium concentrates in the myocardium. Huge numbers of leukemia and cancer, thyroid cancer and the like. Now, I want to describe to you the various forms of radiation that are produced by the isotopes in the reactor. We're not taught this in medical school. So, and I know this because I was asked by the editor of the New England Journal in 1978 to write an article about the medical consequences of nuclear power. I spent a year researching it in the Countway Library at Harvard, and I wrote the paper, and it went out to peer review, and they said, well, you didn't say anything good about nuclear power. And I said,